I've always loved all animals. I've noticed a pattern that the more we learn about any given kind of animal, the more we appreciate how complex they are, the more they exceed our prior expectations. And just a few examples, we think people generally don't like rats, but they love to laugh, they love to play, they love rough and tumble play when they're young, and rats who get used to a human hand tickling their belly will chase the hand to get more tickles. And you can watch YouTube videos of that and a lot of the things I'll mention today. Rattlesnakes play nannies. They do daycare. They will watch baby rattlesnakes. One female will stay behind and look after the young of several other females until they come back. And then you have unusual things like whale play, where humpback whales in the Sea of Cortez will balance dolphins on their noses, and dolphins will slide down the nose. It appears to be like a playground game of slide. But it's easy to overlook this lovely phrase, the smaller majority. There's a frog on the cover of this book, but actually if you look at this beautiful book, most of the animals featured in it are insects. And there's good reasons for this. Insects are a predominant life form on the planet. They've been around since before the dinosaurs. They are far and away the most successful group of animals. 80% of all species on planet Earth are insects. And it's estimated there's about 10 quintillion living insects on the planet at any one time. And there's about 1.4 billion of them for every one of us. There are 10 times more kinds of beetles than there are all kinds of vertebrates on planet Earth. Vertebrates are subphylum. They're basically a phylum level, and then several levels down, the order of Coleoptera is the beetles. A geneticist once said that God must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles because of so many kinds that have evolved on planet Earth. It's estimated that the total biomass, the total weight of all termites on Earth is about 10 times that of humans, and the same can be said of ants. This is a quite big ant. This is a bulldog ant that I photographed while I was visiting Australia. They've got an impressive bite. I didn't put that to the test. And that's good news. All those ants is good news for this assassin bug who curiously stacks the dried husks of dead ants on its back. The one theory is that it's to ward off spiders who might otherwise try and attack the assassin bug. And insects are also very beautiful, physically beautiful, not to everybody and not every insect. This is a blowfly, I think from Southeast Asia. I find them particularly beautiful, and of course this one, the color is just so alluring. So today I'm going to cover a number of topics in the context of insects. I'm going to talk about sentience, or feelings, to use a more lay term, cognition, or intelligence as we more usually refer to it as, sociality, or interrelationships, both within and between species, and the human factor. What are the implications for us of insects living on the planet, or trying to live on the planet? So let's start with feelings. This is a aptly named big-headed fly, and this is a male. I should probably get a picture of a female for comparison's sake. Adult males, their main job is to try to procreate, so they're on the make. They're keeping their eyes out, literally, for females. And so it behooves males to have big eyes, sense around eyes. You're also useful for detecting predators and approaching danger. But these enormous eyes with incredibly good vision are primarily for males to spot females flying by and to pursue them. With regard to the feeling of pain, there's growing evidence that insects appear to feel pain. This is an important concept as opposed to mere nociception, which is the detection of a noxious stimulus without any experience of pain. But the way animals respond flexibly suggests that they're actually experiencing something, and the rise in our awareness of cognition and emotion of insects fits that. So if you put a cricket on what's called a hot plate, which is a surface that meddling scientists can control the temperature, and they turn the temperature up so it gradually heats up, it gets to a certain temperature, the cricket will run off. But if you give them morphine, the temperature has to go higher before they'll run off. And then if you give them an antagonist, something that cancels the effect of morphine, naloxone for instance, they'll run off sooner again. So the drugging of the flies and how they respond to that is exactly the same as a mouse or a mammal or us. I haven't done the hot plate test myself, but it would be similar. Flies who've had one leg amputated, again by meddling scientists, will show hypersensitivity in that leg 6 weeks later. So this is suggestive of the experience, some sort of experience of pain, some sort of negative experience. And a number of experiments with other vertebrates, non-insects in this case, although these are crabs and lobsters and crayfish, are arthropods, show that they too have a similar response to pain. And there's evidence also of pleasure. I won't describe the experiments that were done, but they're quite compelling. And there's evidence that sex is fun as well for insects. They certainly have unusual ways of coupling. These are snipe flies. It's a female on the bottom, male on the top. Females typically are larger than males because they have to carry eggs to procreate. And it's been shown that, kind of similar to humans, male fruit flies who are rejected by females are more likely to consume alcohol. There are orchids that hoodwink flies into coming and mating with them, flies or wasps or bees. This is an orchid flower that looks alluringly like the swollen abdomen of a female, and so the wasp will come in and copulate with this flower. The flower doesn't even give them nectar, and that, of course, when that bee or wasp goes to another orchid of the same species, it passes the pollen along. And there's different orchids will sometimes stamp the polonium, a pollen-containing structure, onto the insect, and they stamp them in different locations, so that way, even if the insect goes to a different species of orchid, it's a different location that's going to transfer the pollen to. So you can have less faithfulness to a particular flower species, and nevertheless, it could be stamped on the head, the eyes, the back, and it'll pass on to the right species once the insect goes to that species. And bumblebees have been shown to have joyous play. They will forego a direct trip to a nectar lunch. They can go straight to that, but if you put a side chamber with colored wooden balls, they are happy to take a detour before having lunch. So they'll forego food, and instead they can roll these colored balls around. And if you stick the balls to the ground, they're less likely to go. They'd rather go to a chamber with balls that can be rolled around because it's more fun. So insects have joy and fun. It meets all the criteria of play behavior. What about intelligence or cognition? What's going on in an insect's mind? This is a picture of the neurons from about 1/4 of a fruit fly's brain. So even though they're so much smaller than animals like us, nature's a brilliant miniaturizer, and there's a lot of complexity can be packed into a very small space. Fruit flies do have brains, complex brains with different parts that do different functions for them. I like this quote from a German author, Ernst Junger. As I say, nature and evolution is a brilliant miniaturizer. And you may be surprised to know that flies have attention spans. Once again, I often need to make the disclaimer that some of the experiments that I describe are not necessarily animal friendly. Nevertheless, these are published in peer-reviewed journals and they're compelling. And so I think the evidence, I'd rather use the evidence since it's already there than not use it at all. So hopefully people will respect animals like insects that we tend to think are not capable of some of the things that science is showing they are. How do you test for an attention span in a fly? Well, the method used here was to put electrodes in the fly's, a couple of electrodes in the fly's brain. The fly is attached usually by wax to a device that keeps the fly in one place. And then you put the fly inside a drum that can be rotated. You can put different symbols on the drum. The fly's brain shows a sudden spike of activity when this cross comes by in the rotating drum. But as it goes by again and again and again, it becomes repetitious, the fly sort of becomes bored, and so doesn't show as much of a response. The spike goes down to almost zero. Then if you replace the X with a square in this case, when the square comes by, it's a new stimulus, it's a new symbol. And the fly's brain shows a renewed high spike. So it's sort of like the idea of getting bored or getting habituated to the same thing, and our brain doesn't show as much interest after a while, and neither does theirs, but you replace it with a new stimulus and suddenly you have an uptick in attention. You can also, when their attention is high and it's spiking high, they're less likely to notice say a picture of another fly in their peripheral vision, that kind of focus is another hallmark of attention. Bring back the X again, or the cross.
Later on.
Yeah, later on. It'll spike more than it did after they'd had it repeated, as you might expect. So yeah, it kind of fits expectation to how we respond. Female fruit flies watch the mating behavior of other female fruit flies, and they're more likely to mate with a male who's had success. So it's sort of a I'll have what she's having kind of phenomenon. I'm going to be honest, this was a dead bumblebee, but it was useful for a pose. One of the clues that it's not living is that the tongue is not sticking out, which normally it would be. When you rescue a honeybee or a bumblebee and offer them sweet water, they'll lap it up usually eagerly and fill their tanks and refresh themselves so they can go and fly back to their hive. I recommend bee rescue, and I'll mention that again at the end of my talk. There's a lab in London run by a guy named Lars Chitka that has been doing experiments about learning and cognition, joy, the joy studies I mentioned just earlier with the colored balls. The same lab did that work. In this case, this is problem solving, so there's a little pool, a little bit of nectar in the middle of this disc, and you can give the bumblebee an opportunity to interact with this. The bumblebee, I guess, can smell the nectar, knows there's nectar there. How does it access it? Some really smart individuals will actually pull the string. The vast majority won't be able to do that, but if they watch another bee doing that, they will learn to do it themselves. That's learning by observation, which is considered a quite high-level cognitive skill. And bees have also been shown to see, they appear to have a concept of zero, which is considered pretty sophisticated as well. If you present them with a piece of paper with one black dot or some other kind of what's it on it versus say 3, and they get rewarded for choosing the lesser of the two, then they learn to choose the, say, 1 versus 3, and then you present them with a blank page, they're more likely to go to the blank page compared to 1. So that appears to show that they have a sense of the number 0. This is from a study of wasps where they showed, you basically can show them by punishing them for choosing the wrong color. You could actually reward them by choosing the right color. And if they show, for instance, if you teach them that blue is better than red is better than yellow, they know by inference that blue is better than yellow. So it's the A is greater than B, B is greater than C, therefore A is greater than C. They can do that, they can figure that out. I found this quite mind-blowing to learn that paper wasps have unique faces within a colony, and they recognize each other individually by face. So once again, meddling scientists use computers to jumble up the faces of some wasps, and when they presented the jumbled up faces, the other wasps in the colony didn't recognize them and attacked them and repelled them from the hive. So we have individual face recognition in wasps. Now, why am I showing you this? It's not an insect. Cleaner wrasses pass the mirror self-recognition test. This is a test that's thought to be very high cognitive level because it's considered the demonstration of self-awareness. So if you put blue striped cleaner wrasse in front of a mirror, at first they'll threaten it, they may swim behind to see who's there. But if you leave the mirror there for a while, they start to change their body posture, and they seem to be recognizing that the reflection in the mirror is themselves. And then if you put a colored dot on their chin, for instance, where they can't see that unless they're looking through the mirror, they will regard it and swim in such a way they can maybe see it, and then they'll swim down to the bottom to try and rub off the dot on the substrate at the bottom. When the mirror self-recognition test was first developed in 1970, it was done on chimpanzees, and it was a big deal. Chimpanzees are self-aware, or they appear to be self-aware. And now we have evidence that fishes have this, and even ants pass the mirror self-recognition test. It took 5 years for the research team to publish this one in a journal because it was so controversial a finding, and I don't know how long it took them to publish this one. But ants, in this case, the ant sees its reflection in a mirror and starts preening the antennae. In this case, the same sort of thing. The ant freezes and seems to regard itself, or herself, I should say. If it's just a piece of glass with different ants running back and forth, they kind of ignore each other. If you put a blue dot of paint on the front of the ant's head, it gets to the mirror, it looks in the mirror, and it regards and starts preening the blue dot. If the blue dot is behind on the back of the head where the ant can't see it, it doesn't engage in preening behavior. And if you put a brown dot, which is sort of invisible, this is controlling for the feeling of having something painted on your head. So these are just control experiments that scientists come up with. Then the ant doesn't change its behavior because it doesn't know that anything is there. Tool use also in ants. They are highly social animals, and they communicate with antennation, where they touch their antennae together. And if you put various resources around a plate of sweet liquid, they will interact with them. They'll break down pieces of sponge into smaller pieces because they learn that when you soak a big sponge, it's too heavy to carry. So they break them into smaller chunks and carry them back to the colony. And this just shows a phenomenon that most of us have seen before. The message gets out, they communicate the resource to other colony mates, and the numbers rise as the ants come along to the food source. They also knew to reject certain tools that were not effective at sponging up and absorbing this sweet liquid. Jumping spiders are kind of the darlings of some scientists in terms of cognition research. They have incredible vision. They have eight eyes, 2 big headlights at the front, which you can see right there. And this is one species of jumping spider from Southeast Asia, I think. And they will take a detour to get to prey, even if it means crawling behind something, a barrier, and moving further away. And they show object permanence, something that takes a couple of years or so for human children to develop. Again, it's considered a pretty high-level cognitive skill. Interrelationships, social behavior. Here we have an example between species. Ants farm aphids, and it's a mutualism, right? It's a symbiosis, I'm sure you've heard of it, in which the ants provide a police service to the aphids, and the aphids produce honeydew, which the ants love. It's a sweet nectar-like substance. And so the ants get food in return for protection for the aphids. And then some new studies, including one that just came out a couple of weeks ago. This is Matabele ants from Africa, highly social ants that attack termite colonies. And termites have good defenses. Termites fight back, so often the ants returning to the colony are injured. They're missing a leg, or maybe 2, even 3 legs. What happens is the uninjured ants will pick up injured ones and carry them back to the colony to be nursed back to health. And you can see in this picture the injured ant holds the legs in to be more cooperative, to be easier to carry. If an ant is morbidly injured and knows she's morbidly injured and can't recover, she will flail her legs, essentially in a way of repelling the would-be rescuer that I'm not worth the effort. And when they take them back to the colony, these ants have glands in the back of their heads that contain antiseptic properties, and the nurses apply those to the wounded limbs. The limbs, of course, don't grow back, but they can become infected, and they're much less likely to be infected if they're treated. Studies show that nursed ants have about an 80% recovery rate, and unnursed ants have about a 10% recovery rate. So it makes a big difference. And the nursed ones will go out on future forays for termites. And the paper that was just published last week was ants in Florida ants, so a totally different species on a different continent, who also do forms of nursing, including amputation of legs that are infected that can risk the colony. So they'll amputate the leg and then treat the stump with these antiseptic properties. So, ants have the benefit of long periods of evolution and very, very rapid generation times, much faster than our generation times. So they have the luxury of things evolving at a higher rate. You've all heard about pollination systems. It's probably the biggest symbiosis on the planet, where flowering plants produce these alluring smells, attractive colors, and nice rewarding nectar in return for a pollen transport service essentially to benefit plant sex. And flies are certainly very important pollinators too. Bees are sort of the darlings of pollinators, but in many parts of the world, particularly high altitude and latitude, bees can't tolerate the cold, whereas flies can. So they play a particularly big role in certain areas. And these syrphid flies, or hoverflies, they act as mimics for stinging insects. They have no sting themselves, although as larvae they're pretty wicked parasites of other insects. They are very important pollinators as well. Pet theory. This is unpublished. I'm not going to try and publish it, but I might try and get an entomologist interested. And that is, it struck me that this little hoverfly that I photographed on the shore of Lake Ontario a couple of years ago, the tail end looks a lot like a wasp face to me. So I think this is just an example of mimicry. It's at no cost to the insect to evolve having a rear end that looks like the head of a wasp. And other insects recognize wasps as predators and don't want to mess with them. It's just a theory, but it's just an example of how evolution sees to it that fortuitous characteristics can evolve through natural selection. How many bees do you see in this photo? Hands up if you think you see 2. Most of us would think that. And the one on the bottom, indeed, is a bee, a bumblebee. But the one on the top is a drone fly. It's a species of fly that mimics bees to benefit from the the fact that bees tend to repel would-be predators because of their sting. So the fly doesn't have to produce the sting, just has to look like the bee. And so convincing is this mimicry that there are certain companies that make honey sometimes accidentally put pictures of drone flies on the jar. No honey will ever issue from this insect. So maybe you want to buy a different brand of honey, but it's just another form of deception and manipulation. I write about a lot of this stuff in my book, Superfly. Flies they're sort of, I think of them as entrepreneurs. They're very opportunistic. I just love this picture, how one tiny little midge, biting midge, kind of reflects the shape of the giant crane fly beneath it that the midge is biting. So flies get bitten by flies, so don't feel like you're the only victim. Charles Darwin, when he saw flowers growing in the wild that had very long nectar tubes, he theorized there must be animals that have long tongues or long beaks. And it was after he had died that it was discovered that you have long-nosed flies, such as this one here, insects that do in fact have very long nectar-reaching faces. It's a co-evolved trait. I don't know quite specifically why I'm showing you this, except that I think horseflies are pretty scary and impressive. They're out for our blood. But some mosquitoes, of which there's several thousand species, can be very beautiful as well. So I'm going to finish up with a little bit about the Anthropocene and how we're affecting insect populations. And this term, bugpocalypse, was coined by, I think, a New York Times writer or someone like that. The extinction rate is much higher for insects than for other vertebrate animals. And the total biomass is falling very rapidly. 2.5% per year is a pretty disturbing number. Well, pesticide use is a big reason. And the big reason for pesticide use is because we're raising animals to eat them. It's much less efficient than eating plants directly. Often monocrops are used. These are like ecological deserts for insects and other animals. And animal agriculture is a very inefficient phenomenon. As you can see the numbers here, it takes up about 83% of all agricultural land and produces only 18% of the calories that we consume. And human eating habits are a particular new threat in terms, if insects are sentient, then the moral landscape changes in terms of how we make food choices. Entomophagy, or eating insects, is becoming quite a rapidly growing sector of food production for humans around the world. Most of it right now is feeding it to livestock, and the numbers are pretty impressive. They're going up very rapidly in the trillions of flies that are produced for this, and also crickets and some other insects. But there are companies getting millions of dollars in investments to develop these businesses. The popular ones are black soldier flies, also called compost flies. They're very efficient at transforming compost into fly tissue. I'm not necessarily suggesting that this is equal in moral concern to raising pigs and chickens and cows, which are big, complex vertebrates, very clearly sentient. Nevertheless, the growing evidence of sentience in insects should give us some pause about whether this is a really good approach to produce food for human consumption. Most of the people at this meeting are vegans or leaning that way, and we probably don't think that it's a good idea. I certainly don't think it's a good idea. We can feed ourselves on plants directly is always a better way. So if we're to have a viable future, which show that 100,000 years ago, humans, or hominids, of which there were more than one species, we took up, in terms of biomass on the planet, we took up about 0.04%, so less than 0.5% compared to all the wild vertebrates on land. And today, the numbers are humans 36%, livestock, the animals we raise to eat, 60%, and if you do the math, that's 4% left for wild animals. I was shocked when I learned that. And if we consider that the two of those three quadrants, the humans 36% and livestock 60%, it's very clear a couple of things that need to happen. We need to reel in our numbers. Human overpopulation is a very real existential and problematic issue, and it doesn't get much time in the press at all. And when it does, it's often, oh my God, look, Japan's population is declining, this is a crisis. To me, the crisis is that our populations are growing. And we're creative enough as a species that we can come up with solutions to changing demographics with larger populations of older people in society. But we can't keep coming up with solutions for too many people overrunning the planet and wildlife being reduced to 4% of the total biomass. So in addition to reining in our numbers, we need to change our eating habits away from animal protein to plant protein, which is so much more efficient, so much better for our health, so much more ethical. Just a few little things people can do on a much smaller scale. You can buy insect nesting boxes like this. What are they called, sweetie? Bee hotels, thank you. Yeah, we have one at home. We just had our backyard landscaped, and lawn is going to be being replaced by wildflowers, native wildflowers. And we have a bee hotel that hopefully we will start getting occupied once the new residents move in and the new flowers grow. Time will tell. So this is a little plug for pollinator gardens. We were just in Michigan and we saw signs for pollinator garden development there, and I think I've seen a couple on campus, haven't we?
Yes.
I think there's an effort now to develop some pollinator. I mean, the huge swaths of lawn that we have, it's a little bit like the huge swaths of monocrop cultures to grow grain to feed livestock. They're not at all very good living spaces for native insects and other native animals. So I encourage people to replace lawns with native plants that are native to your region. And we can all perform rescues. This is a live and happy, or getting happy bumblebee. You know, you sometimes find them stranded on the sidewalk after the rain, and they're cold and they're dehydrated, or they're too hungry to fly. You can just bring them in and offer them some sugar water and let them sip. Their tongue usually comes out quite eagerly. They lap it up, they fill their tanks, and then they fly off. They've got a great sense of homing, so they can find their way back to their colonies. And just to close with a touching story, a librarian in England discovered a queen bumblebee who, for some genetic reason, had no wings. And she started to feed the bee and kind of made friends with the bee. The bee would come out each morning to greet her when she went outside. And she formed a relationship, and it kind of touched the hearts of locals when they published it in the newspaper. There she is with her bumblebee. We just got a book that talks about bumblebees, and I haven't learned to identify the different species, but there's all sorts of different kinds of them. I don't know if you've ever held a praying mantis or met a praying mantis and had them look at you. They'll turn their head and look back at you. It's quite an arresting experience. You feel like you're interacting with another being, another conscious individual, and the new science supports that this is probably a conscious individual, another being. So it's obviously nice to know that we're too big to be regarded as prey. These are rapacious predators, but it's kind of touching and I find quite poignant to realize that this is another being who's regarding me, and it's not just me regarding the praying mantis. But we have lots of time for questions, so I'd be happy to take any that anyone has. Thanks. I'm not aware of the praying mantises changing eye color or different colored eyes. I've never seen that myself. That may be just the angle of the light, or maybe they are different colors. But what you may be seeing there is sort of evolution in action, because a big part of evolution is mutations, right? Mutations which are essentially random events, the vast majority of which are unfavorable and are selected out of the population because it doesn't help the animal survive and succeed in mating and what have you. But every once in a while, a mutation is very fortuitous, which is what leads to things like eyes and wings, legs, and consciousness. Consciousness is expensive. It takes a lot of energy to develop a brain with the senses to have consciousness. That was one of the reasons why scientists didn't really believe that an insect could be conscious. But again, the miniaturization factor, these animals or evolution can come up with incredibly sophisticated, complex solutions with working with very small things. And there's just as many organs in a fly as in a whale, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Well, there is, in my book, Superfly talks about all insects, but mostly it is about flies, order Diptera. But I'm working on another book that will have quite a lot of insect material in it, so keep an eye out for that. Yes.
Why do ants line up? Why do they sort of meet by the hundreds?
Like the swarm we saw in front of the Living Learning Center yesterday?
Like that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like an orgy, I think. Most species of ants have particular times of the year where they emerge, and there's the males, usually winged males. I didn't notice that with that colony yesterday. Sometimes you'll see that. So there may be other reasons why they kind of come out and sort of boil out at the surface and kind of get in the, maybe they're sunning themselves. They figure, they heard John Pierre's lecture. They figure it's healthy for them. But if you ever see ones with wings, then it's a mating party time. And it's a bit mysterious as to how they synchronize with other colonies, but they do. And that way you get nice genetic crossover where males from one colony will fly up and mate with females from another colony. Yeah. That's a good question. You know, we're very visual organisms. How much vision do ants have? How good is their vision? It really varies. Matabele ants, I was taught, are blind. I don't know if that's actually the case. But there are some ants with very small, rudimentary eyes. They probably don't have very good vision. Their world is much more chemically driven. They have lots of different pheromones and other chemicals that they share, and that they have signals and messages in those. I mentioned antenation, where ants actually touch antenna. You may have seen that when they meet each other going in opposite directions. They stop briefly and they tap their antennae together, and that's communication going on. How sophisticated that communication is, you know, we could find out that ants have been using ChatGPT for 10,000s of years, but I doubt that. But there's probably there's certainly ways to study the kind of information that's exchanged, but I think we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of what's going on and how complex it is. Yeah, good question. Most of us are aware of the dance language of the bees, which is true language. It's symbolic. It's conveying information about direction, distance, quality of a food source through symbolic, through this dancing behavior. The intensity of the dance, the direction of the dance, and the duration of the dance convey information of these three types. And so we know honeybees do that. There are other bee species that produce honey, and I'm pretty sure they're also signaling to each other where to find it, how far to go, what direction. And by the way, the direction, which is the angle that the bee does the dance in the dark of the hive, keep in mind that the hive is usually very dark. That angle will change according to the passage of the sun across the sky. So if it's a long way away that a honeybee has discovered the food source, a nice patch of flowers, say, in the 10-15 minutes it takes the bee to fly back, the angle of the sun will have changed. And the bee changes the angle of her body according to that. So it really is remarkable how closely it tracks the food source in terms of direction. This harasser in the front row is asking me to mention something about clover. The landscape company that we hired, we discussed options with them, and we're replacing the little bit of lawn that would have remained, we're replacing it with clover. And clover this particular clover, white clover, is a native species, I believe we were told, in our community, in that part of the world. And it flowers and is quite attractive to pollinators. So.
And you don't have to cut it at all?
I was going to say
if you don't
yeah,
want,
it grows short.
or
so
you can mow it.
Yeah, I have an old-fashioned push mower because we have very small yards. And we have an electric as well, but it would be nice not to have to use that at all.
Yeah.
Although I do like that I get the grass clippings from the mowed lawn that I can put in my composter, because I finally learned that compost needs to be about 3 parts dry or drier vegetation to 1 part of the wet stuff that is left over from our kitchen. And since we eat lots of plants, there's lots of wet stuff. So it's nice to mix it up with the grass. Yes? Sure. I was asked to repeat those figures from earlier in my talk on the numbers of insects versus the number of humans and the like. So the numbers, as I recall them, 80% of all species on the planet, that's plants and animals, all the fishes, all the vertebrates on land, all the other invertebrates, earthworms and roundworms, etc. 80% of all species are insects, so a particular group of arthropods. And it's estimated that there are about 10 quintillion insects living on the planet at any one time. Now I should add, a lot of these are not visible to us, like flies, for instance. They're going to be larvae or eggs buried under the surface of something, so not very visible. But they're there and they're alive, and if everything goes well, if they're lucky they win the lottery, they will end up being an adult fly or an adult insect. So there's about 10 quintillion insects alive at any point, and that's about 1.4 billion per human. So in terms of just numbers, we're vastly outnumbered by insects in the world. Yeah, he's seen, and some of you probably have seen documentaries where the beekeeper goes and gets a lot of honey from a hive, and in some cases, hopefully, they leave enough for the bees to survive on through the winter. And the question is, why and how do the bees produce such a surplus of honey? And I'm not an expert on apiary and on the beehive and the honey industry, but I do know there are practices in there that are not very nice to the bees. But hopefully responsible honey farmers do leave enough for the bees to live on. And as for the surplus, well, it's just an adaptation. If they have a healthy hive with lots of good, healthy foragers, then they'll be able to produce lots of honey and excess. And having an excess is sort of a safety net, if you like. I guess the bees maybe won't know ahead of time if they have enough. They probably do know ahead of time, but it's good to have extra because you can continue to grow the hive. So that's my take on that.
Thank you.
By the way, it reminds me, there's a wonderful documentary called My Garden of 1,000 Bees, and it's by a filmmaker, an independent filmmaker in Bristol, England, and he's done a lot of filming for BBC documentaries and the likes over the decades. During the pandemic, his career was put on hold. There was no demand for him going out into the field and filming. And he's a specialist in insects, so he has beautiful cameras that can get really super hyper up close, macro lenses and the like. And this hour or so long documentary talks about the individual bees that he discovered in his yard. He put out bee hotels and other habitat things that were attractive to the bees. And he had names for them, like Nick had a little nick out of one of the wings. So you got to know these little bees and wasps, these obscure species that we don't generally notice. There's hundreds and thousands around the world, and not only obscure species, but individuals within them. And I thought that was a very touching angle to the documentary, that you appreciated the individuality, the unique individuality of these animals. Some were more shy than others. They wouldn't come out of their little nest holes if he was up close with the camera. But after a few weeks, vis-a-vis the attention span and habituation, they learned to trust him. They recognized him and they would come out. Great, yeah. I hadn't heard about this documentary about a Romanian woman.
Is it Honeyland? It might be.
Honeyland, perhaps. We all know how compelling visual media is for us.
Yes.
And since we kind of run the planet, or at least we act like we do, it's a very important medium. It's very heartening to learn of films like that.
I think you should name shouldn't call it a bee hotel, it should be an Airbnb.
If I don't give them food, it's just an Airbnb, I guess. I've been at one of those. At the back, yeah. So the question is, like cockroaches, for instance, they have, as all insects do, a sort of somewhat distributed nervous system with a ganglion, or several ganglia, sort of nerve centers throughout the body. And that's, I think, pretty universal to insects, but they also have a brain, and I think all insects do have a major ganglia in the head, which we would call a brain. Other groups of animals, other invertebrates, don't maybe quite have that structure, but octopuses, which are sort of there we go again, the darlings of invertebrate research these days, they have more than one brain, and they have sort of ganglia for each arm, and the arms can do independent things. They can be carrying half a coconut and walking along the bottom with 2 legs. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's hilarious to see. And so different groups, different phyla of animals, phyla, have different brain anatomy. But certainly insects with the distributed brain, they have the ganglia, but they do have the brain, which can, as you saw from some examples, can perform some impressive tasks. But I should add that it is a hugely diverse group of animals. So just because some insects can do amazing things, other insects may not have evolved in that particular direction to be able to do those things, because maybe it's just not useful to them. Dancing to show where nectar is, where a patch of flowers is not useful to a cockroach, but cockroaches are very guileful about living in people's homes. And by the way, I shouldn't say that, because I think there's about 400 or several thousand known species of cockroaches around the world, and only about a dozen will come into homes. So they get all the bad press for all the other cockroaches that are out there.
What about wood bees? Do you know about wood bees?
What about wood bees? I would be very happy if I did. But I'm sorry, I don't know about wood bees. Carpenter bees?
Carpenter bees.
Yeah, we used to have them in our deck
Yes.
in Maryland when I lived there. And they burrow in, they do like about an inch in, and then they go to the side. And
They
then
seem very
put their larvae.
interested in-
I've noticed they do aerial combats. They're very territorial. You have them chasing each other during that peak time when they're building their nests. I also once saw a hairy woodpecker with a young with them, a fledged young, come in and just hammer away at one of these, because they plugged the holes, but the woodpecker probably can hear them inside, and hammered away and eventually pulled out a fat white grub of a carpenter bee and fed it to the young. Actually shared it with the young. Let the young have half and the other half. So not a good day for that carpenter bee. Yes. So go ahead.
A lot of people don't realize how cruel humans are to bees to get the honey. I know they pull out the wings of the queen bee so she'll stay in place, and they squeeze to death the male bee to get his sperm. Do you know other stuff that we can share?
I watched a short film, I think maybe on YouTube, that talked about some of these practices. But yeah, some of the practices are quite brutal, not very nice practices, and probably depends on the operation. But I think the really big operations that are done on large scale, it's kind of like factory farming. There's more likelihood that there's going to be some less bee-friendly practices being done. Is there evidence that bees and other animals can feel stress? I don't know if anyone's demonstrated that stress in insects, but the fact that bumblebees can appear to experience joy in playing with colored rolling wooden balls or other toys that they might provide them suggests to me that they have the emotional sophistication that the flip side of joy, I don't know about depression, but stress, negative affect, that they're probably capable of that, I would think. But very little research to date on that sort of thing. Yes, I did mention that. I mentioned the new study that shows that Florida carpenter ants will amputate the injured limbs of other ants to prevent infection from growing up into the ant and spreading through the colony. That was just published a couple of weeks ago, and the same research team in Africa showed that Banabili ants will practice self-triage in a system where the ants assess their own morbidity after being injured by termites, and that if they deem themselves too injured, they won't cooperate with other uninjured workers to carry them back to the colony to get nursing. And the nursing involves taking antiseptic substances from a gland on the back of the head or the thorax and applying it to the site of the wound. And it has disinfecting properties and healing properties. I don't believe ants can ever regenerate limbs. That may be a future discovery, but they can treat limbs, and the ants can still get around on 3 or 4 legs, so that's a benefit of having 6, I suppose.